There we go.
Okay.
We are live. Yes.
How exciting.
Exciting. Yeah, great to see you again, John.
Good to be here.
Yeah.
Good to see you. How are you?
All right. I'm doing all right. I mean,
the lower Berkshires.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful out here. And it's a balm in these times, which is sort of what we'll be talking about a little bit today, how our practice and how the Dharma can be a kind of a refuge from the craziness of the world, because there's two ways to look at the Dharma, and I think we've discussed a little bit of this in the past. In fact, a number of times, the way that we can use the Dharma as active, as sort of informing our action in the world. But there's also another aspect of Dharma that people are looking to, and this is one of the things I find when I discuss this on some of my videos, is that there's a certain group of the audience that really looks to Dharma, I think, for a different kind of thing. They're looking for it as a refuge, a recharge from ordinary life, as a way to leave all of the worldly concerns behind for a time, in order to touch into something that's more profound, more important, more real, so that they can come back to deal with the world in a better frame of mind. And I think there's sort of, as a result, there's kind of two ways we can look at how we approach the Dharma here. And I think that second way is one that's important not to lose sight of, especially when we feel like we're being ground down by the news every day.
Sure. I think that it's a really important topic. I think it's not one or the other, first off.
Exactly.
And I think the risk of some people, it's one thing to use it to recharge, as you say. That's really important and really essential. It's another thing to use it as an escape, and to sort of, because then it becomes almost a form of spiritual bypassing, and that's where it gets challenging. And I think that by recharging, then it allows us to come into the world and respond in a way that's actually effective and appropriate. What I really wanted to bring in is, and we'll put a link to this, but Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's quite an activist in the Dharma, and he was giving a speech for the. Oops, excuse me. I've got to exit full screen so I can find it here. He was giving a speech for the. It's right here. It was published in Lions Roar magazine. This was during UN International Day of Vesak, and he was in Ho Chi Minh City and was giving the keynote address. And the name of the speech was "Protecting Human Dignity from the Threat of Moral Nihilism." And then he talks about human dignity, and he talks about the drift toward nihilism, and gives all the factors of that. And then he talks about what a dignified society would look like, which has to do with, just a world which is safe and beautiful and flourishing in its natural environment, a world of peace, a world with more genuine democratic governance, fairly equal standard of living. Everybody has the right to receive a well-rounded education. It's very idealistic. And there's, gender equality. And then, however, he brings in a term which he calls conscientious compassion, which is an active form of compassion. Because we have, of course, one, it's like if from the Bodhisattva perspective, right, we have the Bodhisattva of compassion, who's Kuan Yin, who is hearing the cries of the world, who is fully present for all the suffering in the world, and simply by being present, she is helping by their presence. They're helping alleviate the suffering in the world simply by being present with that and taking it all in and holding it, as opposed to, say, Green Tara, who I think is the bodhisattva of a more active compassion. And so this idea of conscientious compassion, but to, of course, really cultivate that, we need that space to sit, to find that grounding that we can find through meditation, and that. So finding the balance between these things is, I think, really important. And how do we balance basically form and emptiness? So if we think of form as being the world we live in at this moment, is the world of form, the world of some pretty challenging times in this moment. We can't turn away from that, and yet we need to sort of rest in the boundlessness of awareness in order to actually move forward in a active, compassionate way, whatever that means for each of us.
Yeah. I mean, we can't, as you say, we shouldn't turn away from it in the sense of spiritual bypassing, like you were talking about before. But at the same time, we don't want to be swept away by it.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, that's the other extreme that we're prone to, and I find this in myself, and I certainly hear it echoed in other people around me. Is a certain way that we can be. Well, we're surrounded now in so much of the news by stories of hatred, stories of greed, of avarice, stories of delusion, of ignorance.
We see it so clearly.
But the one of the dangers is that these poisons infect us, and because it's so easy, right, that we become inured to it in a certain sense, and now we are feeling the hatred. We are feeling our own sense of greed, of wanting something really, really, and being willing to do whatever it takes to get it. Our own delusions start arising in various ways. And there are, of course, many, many ways that we can be swept away by our own delusions when we are pressed in this way. And so I think it's so important, at least I find in my practice, it's so important to be able to take that time away, whether it means, going for a walk in the forest, or, sitting with my 2 kittens, or doing meditation, or, there's different ways of doing it. For each of us, we'll find our own way, but a way of really recharging and touching into, I mean, the Buddha says, one of his first recommendations and pieces of advice is to avoid associating with fools, and to associate with the wise. And that's, I think, what we're talking about here is that, we need to be aware of the news, but we've got to also be concerned about not becoming infected by the news, and instead spending time with the wise, like spending time with you here, instead of spending time listening to somebody, chattering away on some news program.
Right. And I mean, this is, of course, in a way, well, it's a trap we fall into, and it's neither left nor right. Both, the left can get very self-righteous in their way of looking at things without seeing beyond that. And so the practice that we're, by turning inward, and by actually really looking at what's happening inside, in this heart-mind complex, that opens up the possibility for seeing beyond these deluded ways of being, which are not restricted to one side or the other. We all fall prey to delusion. What I find really interesting, though, and I
You got a dog behind you, by the way.
I have a dog behind me. It's true. Well, I can't help that.
Nope.
Not literally behind me, just
Nope.
in the yard. And
Yep.
it's funny, on Zoom it gets filtered out, but on StreamYard it doesn't.
It does not so much.
It's all right. We'll just
We'll keep going.
Yeah, he
or she is letting their opinions be known.
Exactly, very vocally. So then, there's the question, like within a Dharma context, of whether politics should even be discussed.
Well, exactly.
And I don't see personally that it can be avoided. I think that it's important to speak about it from a place of clarity, not from one side or the other. And how do we hold that? And that can be a challenge. I certainly remember being in the first Trump term. I was doing a lot of teaching at New York Inside, and it was very hard to not say something, or not say something that was clearly stating, my very strong point of view, for fear that it might offend somebody who was in the Sangha, who actually had a very different point of view. And of course, the teaching on not holding to opinions or not holding to fixed views plays into this, so how do we have a view without holding to a fixed view, and practicing with that? And I think that this time on the cushion, or taking a walk in the woods, if we truly are present with what's going on in me, in us, in each of us, we can see how quickly we constrict around a view. And what happens if we soften that view? Where does that bring us? So I think that's one important factor. The other important factor for me is, I think I talked about it here before, our tendency in terms of form and emptiness, for instance, our tendency is to only see things in a very narrow time frame. Right? And it's like, oh, this is horrible what's happening now. And it is horrible what's happening now. And in the spaciousness of, say, the absolute, right now it's not this, but this. And, in a longer time frame, whether if we're thinking of linear time or just absolute time or timelessness, what's happening in this moment, as horrible as it is just happening in this linear time frame that we put it in, and therefore it feels horrible to watch what's happening, and it is horrible, and there's more,
I was actually that brings up an interesting other way of looking at that, which is in meditation. We can look at the time a different way, which is to say, we meditate on these things. In other words, we sit in mindfulness meditation. These thoughts about these political things arise in our minds, which is at least how I experience it. And the mind goes back to the past, thinking about all the similar things that have happened in the world in the past and how those turned out.
Mm-hmm.
We think to the future about all the bad things that could come to arise in the future for us because of what's happening now. And it helps to bring ourselves back to the present moment and what's happening right here, and what's happening right here in front of me. And maybe I can take a deep breath and, just listen to the wind outside the window,
Mm-hmm.
listen to birds singing. And that's a different sort of interaction with time, in the sense of just taking the present right now and what's going on right here, right now, and being aware of the fact that the past, we can't change the past. The future, Ajahn Chah says we should have, a very much a mental state of I'm not sure.
Right.
We don't know. Which isn't, I think, it can be taken cavalierly, and it should not be taken cavalierly. I mean, as you say, I mean, things are not good right now. But at the same time, we really don't know what the future is going to be like, and maybe it'll turn out a lot different than we fear. We just don't know, and so leaving those, setting those aside for a moment, and just being here, I think, can be a way of again recharging those batteries, and letting the future take care of itself, letting the past go, and just being.
Well, and as the teaching in the Dhammapada says, let go of the past, let go of the future, let go of the present.
Let go of the present. Yeah, let go of the present.
It's like, okay, we're just here.
Mm-hmm.
There is no past, there is no future, there is really no present. That's what I was talking. That's the timelessness in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what's the response that comes out of that? And we all have different responses in terms of an active response, or a response that comes out of this notion of conscientious compassion. And there's no right or wrong here in terms of our action. Well, assuming our actions are rooted in wholesomeness, there's no right or wrong. We whatever arises for each of us in whatever role we happen to be playing, and wherever we are geographically, however we are, excuse me, however our presence in the world manifests, our appropriate response will come. And it's not necessarily something you have to go digging for. It'll be obvious when it arises, I think. That whole notion of appropriate response seems so abstract, and yet it isn't, but I guess the challenge is not getting hooked on a response which takes us away. It's like, oh yeah, my response is I'm just going to go meditate. Meditation is not going to end a war. Sadly, I mean, it would if everybody meditated. But
yeah,
me meditating is not going to end the war. Me meditating is not going to solve climate change. And just letting go of that is important. And I think, frankly, in anybody who's sort of involved in a community of practitioners, it's a responsibility to sort of point out actions that are unwholesome, that are unskillful, that are rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion, which most of what we're seeing now is. And I have to say, all of what we're seeing now is just rooted in those poisons. So what do we do about it? That's the response. It's like, I don't have an answer for that. What do I do about it? I practice. I teach the Dharma.
Yeah. Well, but we can think of responding from the opposite kinds of intentions. So instead of reacting from a place of anger or hatred, we can try. At least we can consider acting from a place of kindness or compassion.
Yeah, and that's the conscientious.
And instead of greed, we can respond from a place of generosity. And I mean, one of the things I find very interesting in the Buddha's teachings is how, although he does talk about how certain kinds of generosity are more effective than others, he never says that there is a kind of generosity that's bad. Any generosity for the Buddha is positive, and is laudable, and is good karma. I sometimes I'll read people, commenting on videos. They'll say, well, but if you give somebody something because you want something back from them, that's not really generosity. Well, for the Buddha, it was actually. I mean, In other words, most generosity that we have in human society is, to an extent, sort of the altruism out of a sense of ego, right?
Right.
We're doing
Right.
things, we're helping somebody for some political reason because we want to have a world that's better for ourselves, in the future. I don't want to live in a world that's, got horrible global warming and all this stuff. I want to have a pleasant world for myself. And you can say, oh, that's not, but it is. I mean, that's also a form. I mean, it may not be the best form, but look, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. We're coming from a place of our own ignorance and our own delusion and our own greeds, our own angers and hatreds, and we have to, at least in my practice, now in my experience, in my estimation, that's the way I can come at it best, is to say, look, I'm not going to be perfect at this, but if I can at least look towards generosity in general rather than looking at it in terms of what can I get out of it, then the generosity will take care of itself. The generosity is a good way to start. Just
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
kindness and the compassion are good ways to start, even though we're never going to be perfect at it. We're always going to find people we can't really find. We can't be compassionate towards. Well, we'll do what we can.
Yeah. Then at least have compassion for yourself for not being able to be compassionate. But yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, no, absolutely. And as we know, I mean, we've talked about, and I know you've done uh, various videos on how the Buddha was a political being.
Mm.
He had to be, had no choice, and he was not happy with the way things ended at many times, but that didn't stop him from trying. And yeah, so we find that middle way essentially between working with the forms that we're confronting on a daily basis, and living in the emptiness, um, and uh, that gives us hopefully the strength to really do whatever we're called to do, um, and and for some of us, that may be just sitting at home and writing letters or whatever. Um, uh, at least voting. So, yeah. And, I know we have an audience that goes beyond these borders. So every place is different.
Well, and just being
Yeah.
out in the world as a kind and generous presence,
Yeah.
we are, we're inescapably socially political beings, however you want to put it.
Yeah.
And just by, being in the world in a generous and a kind and compassionate way with people around us, in our small way, we're helping to make the world less reactive and,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit less selfish, maybe a little bit less, angry. I mean, because I think, as we all know, a lot of this stuff arises from the anger and mistreatment people feel in their lives, which we may not understand necessarily because we're coming from a different place. But at the end of the day, hatred arises from hatred, and hatred
Yeah.
arises from
From injustice.
their own sense of injustice
Yeah.
somewhere. I mean,
Yeah.
people don't, do these kinds of horrible things just on a whim. They do them because they themselves have been hurt somehow in their own lives. And I mean, you see some of the people now who are in the news a lot, and the hatred that emanates off of them, just sort of like a cloud.
Yeah.
And you sort of, I mean, I have to wonder, what did they go through? Some of it may be, as we might say, karmic or just, biological. I mean, some people are just more that way than others, but I expect that a lot of it is based on causes and conditions in their own lives. And in if we can do our own bit to minimize those kinds of causes and conditions for people around us, then we are just in our own lives being helpful. We don't necessarily need to carry a banner in a
Oh no, yeah,
march.
definitely.
Although that's nice. I mean, if you can do that, peacefully, then you should. But not every way is open or is right for everybody. And I think we have to find even just the small things being important.
And I think that, yeah, I think it's a worthwhile exercise every morning to say, what's one thing I can do today that will be good for somebody else, that will bring good into the world, that will bring compassion into the world, that will bring generosity into the world. One thing, and that's really part of this sharing of the merit. How we bring ourselves into the world, which includes those moments where we bring ourselves out of the world, and just finding that balance.
Mm-hmm. Not letting ourselves be washed away in this, in the river of samsara, which really is, the danger.
Yep. Well, we see it every day.
Yeah,
that danger of samsara.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, indeed. So, all right. I'll put a link into this talk by Bhikkhu Bodhi because it was quite moving, actually. And he's one of our great Buddhist activists, along with a number of others. Tanisra is another great one who does a lot of writing on this, and how she balances. It was great to be with her for a month on retreat because just the recognition how important that was in the context of all her work and for most of us. So that is a value of retreat.
Well, there you go. I mean, there's an example of,
for sure,
of getting away for a time, whether it's for half an hour of meditation or whether it's for a month of retreat.
Yeah. And I do stand by my desire that if 1/12 of the world took a retreat for a month, and we just sort of rotated through 1/12 of the world, things would be a lot different.
Oh yeah.
And there's that famous example that I'm sure has been talked about. We've talked about before of what happened during the Blitzkrieg in London. There was this 5 minutes of silence every night when Big Ben rang at 9, and it was somehow experienced not only by the Brits but by the German pilots. And something happened in those 5 minutes when everybody was just doing in the silence whatever anybody felt was appropriate. There was a real power in that. So,
no, I didn't know about that story.
Yeah, they interviewed people from the Luftwaffe after the war, and they knew that something was happening at 9 o'clock. They just didn't know what, and it had an impact. So this is the mystery, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, friends. Speaking of mysteries, it's a mystery.
Mystery why you don't have any more coffee in your mug.
Well, there's a little bit left, but so we just invite you to help us with our coffee needs and support the program actually through buying us a cup of coffee at diggingthedharma.com, or a whole pot if you'd like. But we need your support to sort of keep us moving forward. But more than that, we also just need your questions and comments.
Yeah, feel free.
Which are really helpful to us. And we'll see you next week.
Yeah, see you next time.
That's the plan. Yeah,
I think so.
Okay. All right. Take care, Doug.
You too. Keep digging the Dharma.
Yep. Never stops.